Questions of civil liberties in Canada arose almost immediately after the British gained Quebec in the treaty ending the 7 Years' War in 1763. The British governor, Sir Guy Carleton, one of the outstanding statesmen of Canadian history, had developed an affection for and a good relationship with the population of what had been New France, then about 75,000 people. And he considered the English population of the colony, only a few thousand who arrived from the American colonies in the last several years, to be commercial exploiters trying to take advantage of the French Canadians. He saw the increasing problems between the Americans and the British, and saw that the British would not be able to collect the taxes they were trying to impose on the Americans, even though those taxes were designed to retire debt that Britain had run up largely to expel the French from North America at the urgent request of the Americans. And Carleton saw that if there were any chance in the event of an American Revolution of preventing Quebec from being taken over by the Americans, it lay in the conciliation of the French Canadians. He accordingly presented to King George III and to the British Parliament in 1770 what became the Quebec Act. It was adopted in 1774 after he had absented himself as Governor of Canada and lobbied for it in London for 4 years to gain the passage of his bill. It was one of the decisive moments in the history of English-speaking liberties, as the adoption of the Quebec Act presented the possibility for Canada to become the successful bilingual country that it is. It was also a step forward in human rights, both absolutely and comparatively with the Americans, who launched their revolution only a year after the adoption of the Quebec Act. That act preserved the civil law that Quebec inherited from France, but Carleton directed that Quebec devise its own civil code, modeled on that of France, to avoid the necessity of seeking French legal precedents. It absolutely guaranteed the official status of French and maintained it as the principal language of education in Quebec. Britain thus renounced any ambition to assimilate the French Canadians culturally to the English language. And it granted complete religious liberty. This obviously chiefly referred to the Roman Catholic Church, but also Protestants, Jews, non-believers, and all others. Unfortunately, in the sort of gesture that provoked the Americans to revolt, the British Parliament declared that the Quebec Act applied to significant parts of what were then territories of the American colonies. In the Revolutionary Continental Congress, Roman Catholicism was declared to be a religion, I'm quoting now, had flooded England with blood and had spread hypocrisy, murder, persecution, and revolt into all parts of the world. It is a bloodthirsty, idolatrous, and hypocritical creed, end of quote. Naturally, these and similar comments were widely circulated throughout French Canada, and they assisted the French Canadian leaders in following through on their promises to Carleton to help defend Quebec from the American revolutionaries. This collaboration enabled Carleton, by the narrowest of margins, to repulse the Americans and to send Benjamin Franklin and the then loyal revolutionary Benedict Arnold packing when they attempted to incite revolution in Montreal and besieged Quebec City in 1775. The French Canadians had been happy to get rid of the French criminal law, which did not have habeas corpus and routinely permitted torture, including the rack, as an instrument of the interrogation of suspects. It was an extremely primitive and degrading system that the French Revolution soon dispensed with, after, it must be said, the Committee of Public Safety inflicted atrocities upon the population beyond anything the French kings had imagined, taking full advantage of the newly invented guillotine. The Declaration of Independence, signed on July 4, 1776, and primarily written by Thomas Jefferson, portrayed the regime in America as the vanguard of the age of reason of Locke and Rousseau and Voltaire. It demonized King George III as a Caligulan tyrant, which the French Canadians knew to be false, as he had been very just in his treatment of them. And the American native people were subjected to a blood libel as barbarous savages, which supposedly justified the Americans in dispossessing them of the continent. Jefferson accused George III, after whom subsequent co-father of Canadian Confederation George Etienne Cartier was named, of, and I quote again, cruelty and perfidy scarcely paralleled in the most barbarous ages, end of quote. The king was blamed, again quoting, for abolishing the freedom of the system of English laws in a neighboring province, establishing therein an arbitrary government, and enlarging the boundaries so as to render it at once an example and a fit instrument for introducing the same absolute rule into these colonies, end of quote. Of course, this was an outrageous allegation, even from a revolutionary trying to inflame opinion. The British had removed the French from Canada at the beseeching of the Americans, Benjamin Franklin in particular, had given the French Canadians the civil and criminal law which they wished, and neither of which was in the slightest uncivilized. The notion that the British wished to expand the Quebec regime into the American colonies was fatuous. The real American complaint was that the British were defining a different and separate Canada to the emerging American states, and on a basis more respectful of human rights than the British had shown in the American colonies. The defamation that the American revolutionary leaders conducted against the actions of both the British and the French in Canada were outrageous. So were the attacks on the Roman Catholic Church, just 15 years before George Washington's famous promise to American Roman Catholics that they would never be persecuted in America. There were several Catholic signatories of the Declaration of Independence. All of this contributed to an almost unanimous consensus in Nova Scotia, Acadia, which became New Brunswick, and in Quebec, to resist the American revolutionaries. Their successful resistance was largely based squarely on the exemplary status of human and civil rights in Canada. It is also worth remembering that while Canada had only about 5% of the free population of the American colonies at this time, it had probably fewer than 100 slaves, compared to 750,000 slaves in the 13 colonies. From the founding of the Great American Republic, and starting a century before Canadian Confederation, the jurisdiction of Canada had an exemplary record in civil rights, which it successfully defended in the American Revolutionary War and ever since.